Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LPL Spring Split plans overview and analysis video. It is finally time to get into some best of fives here in the LPL. The regular season is over. We covered that at the end of last week. Of course, we've covered every single game in the LPL up until this point this year, but it is now time to determine who the final four teams to qualify for the playoffs will be. We already know half the teams. The other half will be determined in today's video. I hope you're excited. I know I am. I previewed a lot of these games at the end of my Week 8 video. Again, you can check that out if you are interested, but today we're going to be going over everything that happened in the play-ins. That means we're going to be going series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the video, we will be previewing the playoff bracket, the thing that kind of really matters coming out of the play-in series, because we're going to know all 8 teams that have officially qualified. Obviously, most of today will be spent talking about the play-in series, but as you can see up on the screen now, we've got a lot of really fun things to talk about here today. Of course, 4 teams already qualified for the playoffs by nature of being top 4 in Group Ascend, them being Top Esports, Anyone's Legend, LGD Gaming, and Billy Gaming. They don't have to go through the play-in stage in order to qualify, but the remaining 6 teams that are in Group Ascend do get a play-in series shot. You know, of course, seeds 5 through 10, and then the top 2 seeds from Group Nirvana also get a shot to take on some of the better teams that have not quite qualified for the playoffs just yet in Group Ascend. So still a lot left to be determined. 4 of these teams will be going on. Remember, it's do or die. It's just one best of 5. If you do not show up on the day, you're going to be left out regardless of whether or not you've done a ton to prove yourself before this series. So I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. That's the format. Let's not waste too much time. Let's go ahead and jump into our first play-in series. Of course, we had 1 per day because they're best of 5s, and so let's go ahead and jump into the action, shall we? Our first play-in series was the biggest discrepancy in terms of seeding. It was the number 5 seed in Group Ascend, which is the top team that doesn't auto-qualify for playoffs, taking on the lowest seeded team, the 2nd seed from Group Nirvana, which means it was the 5 seeded Invictus Gaming taking on the 12th seeded Edward Gaming, and Invictus is going to pick up the 3-0 victory here. They're going to be moving on to the playoffs. It would have been a travesty if they did not win this series. They are clearly the best team in the play-in stage. We've been calling it a top 5 in the LPL over the past couple of weeks because I think really it has kind of developed into that. Somebody just had to be 5th. One of these teams had to, automatically not qualify, and unfortunately that was Invictus. So they had to go through this series, and yes, this is a 3-0, but this is a traditionally Invictus Gaming type of 3-0 where every single game was super close. They had to come back in multiple games. In fact, maybe really all 3 of them you could consider comebacks for Invictus, and Edward Gaming put up a good fight. I think this team is actually pretty good. I think they might even be better than some of the other teams in Group Ascend, but because they underperformed so much in the placement stage, they ended up putting themselves in a position where they had to go through Group Nirvana, and it was never going to be easy. Invictus, again, probably the best team in this play-in stage, and so for Edward Gaming to run into them, it's just pretty unfortunate because I do think there are a couple of teams in terms of where they're at right now that would have been, not very good against Edward Gaming with the way that they showed up here today. Worth noting as well, something that I didn't really talk about in my preview, I think the Nirvana teams are inherently at a disadvantage, not only because obviously they've been playing against weaker talent and they've not really been tested recently, but because they've not been playing stage games. They've played so much less over the course of the spring split than the Group Ascend teams that, we've seen it regularly. The teams that play more games are often in better form, and they often feel more comfortable on the current patch, and so, I think the Nirvana teams were naturally at a disadvantage in that regard. But let's go ahead and talk about how we did end up getting to a 3-0, regardless of whether or not it was an obvious one. Player of the series is a no-brainer for Invictus. It's gotta go to Rookie. Like, there's just no one else you could possibly even give it to. Mako was excellent in this series, and Rookie and Mako were definitely the 2 players that stepped up the most, in my opinion, in terms of how this series ended up going down. But Rookie was the guy. He was the guy on Silas in Game 1, he was the guy on Rise in Game 2, and he certainly was the primary damage dealer on the Akali in Game number 3. It all just really clicked and worked for him. And I think the reason that that's super impressive and really interesting to me is he's not really been that for this team. I've talked about it a lot over the course of this split. He's not a primary option. They don't often try to play for him in terms of the 1v1 or even like later game team fights. They're playing for Jeje, who has gotten a lot of carry junglers over the course of this split, or they're playing for Gala to be able to take over in these late game team fights. Hell, they might even play for the Shy in terms of getting him on this split push, type of champion and really just taking over like we saw on Yorick. We've seen obviously the Nidalee come out from him really consistently. Like, he wants to dominate lane. it's very rare that this team actually wants to put Rookie on something aggressive and, you know, play for him. And it's even rarer when they do that and it works out. Honestly, the thing that I've been pushing for Invictus over the course of this entire split has been Rookie needs to abandon Silas and Akali and Aurora and a lot of these more, you know, melee aggressive-oriented champs. Play the Orianna, play the Azir, play, you know, Syndra, these things that he's played throughout the entirety of his career because he looked so much more successful on the control mages than he ever did on the assassins throughout the regular season. That was kind of disproven in this series. Now, I get it, EDG is not exactly the biggest competition in the world, and maybe they're allowed to get away with it because they're playing against a weaker team, but it's certainly nice to see that Rookie can play some of these, you know, more aggressive assassin-oriented champions, be given a ton of resources, and still be able to carry a lot of these games because he was really the focal point for everything that Invictus and even Edward Gaming wanted to do throughout this series because they put a lot of attention into trying to shut down Rookie on the other side, and it just did not really matter. He was easily the most relevant player in the series, and that's a huge, huge sign for Invictus. I've been a lot lower on Rookie's 2025 than a lot of other analysts, and so I'm glad to see him stepping up when it matters the most. He's far from the only player, though, on his team to play really well. I thought Mako had a great series in the support position, just pretty much heavily outplayed both On and Wink in terms of a lot of the setups he was going for as an engaged playmaker. He's just started to lock in a lot more. He was really bad at the start of the year. I went on and on about how through the first like 5 or 6 weeks of the regular season, he was like genuinely one of the worst supports in Group Ascend, was running down every single game, was one of the biggest reasons this team couldn't find any sort of consistency. Him and the Shy, even Gala, to an extent, were just kind of along for the ride and not so much really contributing to the ride as much as someone like Jeje was. And then obviously Gala got into form and, you know, Mako slowly started to get back. But over the past couple of weeks, he's felt a lot more comfortable with how this team wants to play. And I think generally speaking, it's because the bot lane 2v2 is not receiving quite as many resources in the early game. Jeje has started playing more selfishly, and I think Rookie, like we saw in this series, is receiving more resources himself in the middle of the map, which allows them to be a little bit less, you know, forced to be proactive. Mako can kind of play a style that he feels a bit more comfortable on, and I think that that has helped him quite a bit. He was awesome in this series, and honestly, if you wanted to give him player of the game for game number 3 on the Nico, I totally understand that. I just think Rookie was better throughout the entire series. I don't think anybody is really going to argue me on that. Jeje and Gala continue to be really good. Gala was definitely the better AD carry in this series. Were there some moments on the Kalista where it's like, yoy, that's not very good? Yes, like absolutely. You can point to a couple of different scenarios where he did not play game number 3 nearly as perfectly as maybe you would want, but overall, I would say especially through the first 2 games, he was solid. And then Jeje, you know, really good. He's just a good player. Like, I don't know what to say. I think people are underestimating and underrating just how good he's been across 2025. To me, like a genuine MVP type of player so far this year, and he kind of showcased that against another player in Xiaohao that I'm a big fan of, that I think has been really good over the course of this year, as he almost always is for these middle tier teams. The Shy was also fine. Generally speaking, ZDZ was actually probably better in this series, and we'll talk about that when we get to Edward Gaming, but Invictus being able to pull out the win, not surprising, just definitely a little bit of, you know, craziness in how we got there. And then for Edward Gaming in this series, unfortunately, this will be their last of the spring split, but that's not necessarily a surprise to them. I think the surprise is just how it ended up happening. It really felt like they were in a good position for a lot of this series. They just couldn't quite close anything out, and part of that to me is the fact that On just did not play well. He's going to get dead of the series for me down in the bot lane. You know, we've talked about this a lot when it comes to EDG across this split. The big make or break moment for them is whether or not this bot lane can get back to being a top 6 or so bot lane in the LPL like they have been before. I know that feels very lofty, but these guys have performed incredibly well as a duo previously. They just have not found that form at all in 2025. On, since being reinserted as the AD carry here for EDG, has been very disappointing for this team. I do not think he's returned particularly well, and it was kind of exemplified in this series where he really needed to step up and do a little bit more for this team, and then he was awful in game 3 on the Lucian. He was definitely the worst player in that game in my opinion, and with Gala underperforming on the Kalista on the other side, and some opportunities, we'll just say, opening up for On to play a little bit more aggressive, for him to be so poorly positioned and to constantly be getting caught out in the mid game, it's really frustrating because he needed to be a big piece, and I just don't think he was. Wink was a part of that, maybe more so than he has been in previous series. I still like Wink, and I think, you know, On has definitely been a bigger problem in this bot lane than Wink has been, but this bot lane didn't perform, and at the end of the day, that's more than enough to kind of take EDG out of this series. I do want to give credit where credit is due. ZDZ was the best player on Edward Gaming in this series. The Cho'Gath was kind of useless in Game 2, but Game 1 totally fine on Rumble, and he was super strong in Game 3 on the Aatrox. Unfortunately, Invictus just said, screw it, we're gonna fight without the Aatrox. We're just gonna like pull him into a side lane with the Shy, and then fight 4v4 elsewhere on the map, and they were able to win basically every single one of those exchanges, and so ZDZ ended up feeling kind of useless throughout this game. Not entirely his fault. Part of it is in terms of his positioning, but for a player that I've criticized so much, not only this year, but over the course of his entire career, for him to be the one to step up in a series like this, it's cool to see that it's at least in there. We know he can have flashes of being good. I just don't think he's ever been consistently good throughout his career. You know, Xiaohao was fine. I think he was especially good in Game 2 on the Xin Zhao, but Game 1, Game 3, not really ideal for him. Angel was definitely out-tempoed throughout this entire series by Rookie, but also Rookie received a ton more resources than Angel did throughout this series, so just kind of is what it is for Edward Gaming. This is unfortunately the end of their spring split, but nobody is shocked. I like this team quite a bit, but they rolled pretty low, being the 12 seed instead of the 11 seed, having to go into Invictus. You know, this felt like a pretty obvious outcome, and for IG, they kind of just made the inevitable, if you will, by getting into playoffs. It would have been a gigantic upset if they had not made it into the playoffs, and so to get themselves in there as that final member of the top 5, you know, it's definitely good to see. Then moving on to our second play-in series here, and this is what I would consider to be the first real upset in the play-ins. It was FunPlus Phoenix taking on Ninjas in Pyjamas, the 8 seed, versus the 9 seed, and FunPlus Phoenix is going to pick up the 3-2 series win. Now, they're the higher seed. They were better in the regular season, and so some might look at this and be like, this is definitely not an upset. Ninjas in Pyjamas have looked super shaky over the past couple of weeks. They have a couple of players who have really not been performing all that well. Like, it's not fair to call FPX underdogs here, but I think generally speaking, they were going into this series. Much more of the attention was kind of placed on NIP as the favorites going into this because of their roster. On paper, they absolutely should be better than FunPlus Phoenix. They just haven't been. Like, that's really the best way I can possibly put it. They're not a team that's been good enough to make the playoffs, and that kind of got proven here. And for FPX, they're good enough to be able to, say it with me now, capitalize on the other team's mistakes. That's what they do at a really elite level. They're not great at controlling tempo or pushing the game forward on their own. What they are really good at is spotting out where the enemy team is not necessarily playing optimally and punishing that as hard as they possibly can, and that's what they did here against Ninjas in Pyjamas. I do also have some contrarian opinions about how this series ended up going, because I see a lot of people talking about a couple of players on NIP, and I'm just not really sure that I'm in the same boat. Trust me, there's going to be some positive talk about Leave. I'm not going to sit here and try and trash him, even though I am lower on him as a player, but he did make some mistakes in this series that I think cost Ninjas in Pyjamas. And also, let's not pretend like Aki was the problem on the team in this series. I get that that's the narrative, and generally LPL fans love to blame junglers. He was not the issue here. We'll talk about Doingby, who I just do not think stepped up here today. I thought he was really bad for Ninjas in Pyjamas. But before we get into that, let's go ahead and go to FunPlus Phoenix. Let's talk about the winning team first and what exactly they did well. There is a lot to like about how FPX ended up playing out this series. I think that there are a couple of individual games that I would love to point out. Of course, they ended up winning the odd games here, so 1, 3, and 5. And I think really for me, it comes down to the bot lane, who really stepped up here today. And now that's not really been a surprise for FPX fans. It's a surprise to me in some ways and not so much in others. My player of the series is going to go to Jue in the support position, and this is the one that is obvious and expected. When this team succeeds, it's because Jue has been sensational for them. He was an all-pro pick for me. I put him 3rd team all-pro in terms of my voting. I really do think he's been that good. He was the only player, I believe, outside of a top 6 team to get an all-pro vote from me at the very least. And, you know, I think Jue has more than earned it. He's been one of the best supports in the entire league. I think you can look at that game number 3 on the Recon and see him just completely blow that game wide open, make it basically impossible for Leave to take over on the Kai'Sa or for Doingby to even play remotely safe on the Orianna. Aki was super fed on the Wukong in that game and did a pretty good job of being able to push his team forward, but there just isn't a ton he can do when the Recon is basically stifling every team fight he wants to go for. And then those set engages in game number 5. I love seeing full fearless drafts. Zyra Yone as the mid-jungle duo, Ziggs and Set in the bot lane there for FPX, and it really worked out. The Set support was absolutely massive for FunPlus Phoenix. So for me, Jue as the primary creator, the playmaker, was the player of the series. But if you wanted to give it to his bot lane partner and assume, I'm really not going to be all that upset with you. I'm kind of an Assume hater on this channel. I've pushed back over and over again about Assume being like a good player at this level. I think he's like an average to maybe even slightly below average AD carry in the LPL. And by average, I mean like top 8, right? Because 16 teams in the league. I don't know if Assume would end up landing near the top 8. I just don't see that in him right now. I think he's a slightly worse version of what someone like 1xN is for Thunder Talk. But when they needed him, he showed up in this series. The Ziggs in game number 5 was absolutely ginormous for FPX. He was good on the Corki. He was good on the Misfortune. Like, he was really good here today. He wasn't really making mistakes. He was stepping up when he needed to, and his team fighting was actually just really good overall. This is the version of him that needs to show up a lot more commonly. Again, I'm out on Assume, but only because I don't think he's shown high-end, like, upside traits. This was really the first time in, like, a major series where it was like, oh, those are the high-end upside traits. Those are the high-end mechanics. That's the high-end decision-making. Like, that's the high-end team fighting. We haven't really seen that out of him at a consistent level ever throughout any point in his career. This was a really good showing and a really great time for him to step up. So the bot lane really coming in clutch for FPX here. I do also want to give a shout out to the jungle mid duo, who were just better than their opposition on the other side. Shadow had some phenomenal games here, specifically game 1 on the Vi. I think that's going to get lost because Ninjas in Pyjamas ended up, doing some interesting things in the back half of the series. And, Aki had some problems, especially on the Maokai in game 5, but a lot of that was created by Shadow, who I thought had a really good series. Care was way better than Doingby, was certainly more active and more integral towards how the game ended up progressing than what Doingby was on the other side, basically throughout every game of this series. Sheer was totally fine on the top side, arguably the better top laner between him and Solo Kill. It all just kind of came together for FPX to create a situation where it's like, okay, this is how you get into playoffs, right? Like, this is what you need to do. You need to be able to capitalize when one of your members gets fed, and one of your, players that I'm maybe a little bit less in on needs to step up, and all of those things happen. Jway and Shadow, the players we expected to be good, did a great job of establishing that, and Assume stepped up here today, and that got FPX over the hump. And then for Ninjas in Pyjamas on the other side, like, honestly, this conversation is super easy for me. Leaf played great in their wins. He dominated game 2 and game 4 on these hyper carries that they could enable and really get into a good position so that he could take over, specifically in game number 2 on the Smolder, where he was basically 1v9ing throughout a lot of that game. He wasn't quite as clinical throughout the other games of the series, specifically games 3 and 5, where I think that there were moments where he stepped up way too far. But part of that is PP God just having another really bad series. He's had so many of these over the course of this year, and I've talked about all of them on the channel. I've been out on PP God's 2025. He's been bad this year. Not even like justifiably bad, just generally not good for Ninjas in Pyjamas. It's been a real problem for them. But the real crux of the issue for me was the mid-jungle duo just really not being good enough for Ninjas in Pyjamas, getting outplayed by Shadow and Care on the other side, them having more impact. It's not really acceptable for these two players. Everybody's going to point to Aki. I agree. The Maokai game in game number 5 was really not ideal, but game 3, he was the only one generating any sort of resources for the team on the Wukong. He was pretty good in games 2 and 4, maybe not quite as good as, like, Leave obviously was, but he did a great job enabling his hyper carry ADC, and I'm certainly not blaming him entirely for the Xin Zhao game in game 1. Shadow played excellently on the Vi, and that game, kind of got out of control for a couple of different reasons. I don't think Doingby did anything in this series, specifically in game 5 on the Yasuo. If you're telling me that Aki deserves to get dead of the series because he wasn't very good on the Maokai, Doingby was worse in game 5. I don't even think that's really all that arguable. This Yasuo did literally nothing throughout the entirety of the game. What a wasted pick. Doingby was basically making his team play a 4v5 in that 5th and final game, and I just can't really justify that. He's gonna get dead of the series for me, and maybe people are gonna get upset by this. Maybe I'm gonna see some comments that heavily disagree and tell me that I'm continuing to defend Aki when there's no reason to. I'm sorry, I just do not think he was the problem in this series, and I think the narrative that Aki is the only issue for Ninjas in Pyjamas is going to plague them. If they go into the summer split only replacing Aki, I don't think this team is gonna get a ton better. I think they have to, like, really change up a lot of the foundation. Maybe that means Aki and PP God, I don't know what that means, right? But all I'm saying is that I don't think Ninjas in Pyjamas are one position away from being competitive. I think they should already be competitive, and the fact that they're not means that their macro is broken, and you can see that in terms of how they play the game. Their drafts this series were quite bad. I just don't think it's a good look for a team that absolutely should be in the playoffs. This should be a top 7, top 6 team in the LPL. They have players who won MVP and got All-Pro in the winter split, and now they're sitting here. They're not even going to be in the playoffs. They're not going to be, competing to try and go to MSI. It's just the biggest disappointment of all time. And when I said a couple of weeks ago, the biggest reason that people get upset with Ninjas in Pyjamas is because they have unrealistic expectations of where this team should be. This is the example of that. You know, everybody was like, oh, this team should be fighting for top 4. I don't know how you can possibly look at this lineup, even if you gave them the most charitable interpretation of what they've been, and say that they are a top 4, 5, or 6 team in the league. At best, they're top 7, and at worst, they're not a playoff team, which is what we saw here. So a lot that NIP need to work on, but they've got some time to do it because their split is done. And FunPlus Phoenix, congrats to them. They're going to be moving on to the playoffs. They are almost certainly going to be the weakest team in the playoffs, I guess, depending on what happens in the other play-in series, but the fact that they are there is already a big positive. And you know what? They've got playmakers. Jway has been unreal. I think Shadow's been very good, even if he is Feast or Famine. Sheer is a player that I believe in, almost made Worlds last year. And if Assume and Care are going to be able to step up, players we've questioned over the course of 2025, I don't know, man. FPX might have some playoff magic once again. Then moving on to our third play-in series here, and this is between two teams that I actually had bottom 2 going into the year to playoff for a playoff spot. It's Team WE taking on LGD Gaming, and WE is going to pick up the 3-1 series win. It's pretty well understood that both of these teams, I think, have overperformed what their expectations were for 2025. WE much more so than LGD, but LGD won Group Nirvana. They were the top team in Group Nirvana, so they got an opportunity to be able to earn their way into the playoffs. WE is a beatable team, but unfortunately, WE's on fire right now. They really are clicking in a way that they haven't really all year long. I think they're playing the best that they have all year long, and a couple of their players have really started to step up. If they had a mid laner that I could really rely on in talking about in a positive way, then I would believe this team could potentially be top 6 if everything were to go right. Hell, they still could be top 6. They were the 6th seed going into this series, but you know, LGD not really putting up a ton of resistance in that regard. One notable thing here, Nio not in this series. I don't really know exactly why that's the case. I've heard a couple of conflicting reasons as to why Nio was not playing here today, but Climber was back in the jungle. It didn't really affect them all that much because Climber was actually pretty good this series, one of the better performing players, if not the best performing player on LGD in my opinion across this series. But, you know, I don't know. Like Nio had been such a big reason why this team had found their form over the course of the spring split. To see him not in the series is not ideal, whether you believe it's because he was sick. I've heard that a couple of times from a couple of people. I've heard some people talk about how he's on loan from Top Esports and Top Esports Challengers, and that loan did not extend into the play-in stage. Like, I don't really know what the extent of why he wasn't in the lineup was. I'm sure it wasn't their decision. If it was their decision, I don't understand it under any circumstance, but I have to believe that this was something out of their control. And if that's the case, Climber stepped up valiantly as a player who was replaced midway through the year and, you know, kind of brought out of the lineup, even if he was pretty good for them. So that definitely complicates things a bit for LGD in terms of just where their form has been, but WE was definitely better this series, and I think that does start with the player that I have pointed out every single series. Every single time that WE ends up winning one of these big series, it's because of Monkey in the jungle. Like, he really has been that good for this team. I really think he's, like, on pace to being one of the more interesting junglers in the league. Now, do I think he's perfect? No. I saw some people comparing him to Milky Way from last year, like, essentially saying he's the 2025 version of, like, what Milky Way was in 2024. I can kind of get behind that in the sense that he is a pretty predictable player with a decently limited playstyle that really works when it ends up clicking. And mechanically speaking, he's incredibly talented. I think you could make the argument that Monkey is more versatile than Milky Way was as a player last year, because Milky Way really needed to play carries in order to be successful. Monkey can do that on a ton of different champions, but I do think that feast or famine style can still kind of come back to bite you in a couple of instances. Luckily, when your team is better and when you in particular are more mechanically talented than the players that you're going into, sometimes it does end up working out, and that's what we saw here. He is player of the series. Like I said, he was exceptionally good on Skarner in game number 1. That was probably the most impressive game for me, but he still was great on the Poppy in game number 4 as well. Those are the two games that really stood out. The Viego was also great in game 3. His only game loss is on Trundle, a champion that I just don't think is particularly strong right now anyways. So credit to Monkey. I think he's continuing to grow as a player. Somebody who I praised quite a bit last year when he was filling in for Jeja has kind of been brought in to be the savior for WE and has really succeeded in that regard. He's taken them from being one of the worst teams in the league with Tianjin in the jungle to a team that actively can compete for top 6 and is going to be making playoffs here. So definitely is the biggest reason for their turnaround. A couple of other things. The bot lane was also very good here. Taiyun and Vampire have continued to really step up. Vampire's been getting better game over game. I think Taiyun is just now allowed to do the things he was always pretty good at. He was always expected to be a player that could generate his own leads in the early game. Back in the LCK, he was genuinely one of the worst laners I've ever evaluated. He was bad in the teamfight stage too, but I think his confidence was completely broken. Now, I think he's allowed to play a little bit safer in the early game, can get some marginal leads, and then can actually skirmish in the mid game where he can generate his own pressure. He just wasn't good enough at the other level to be able to do that. The LPL is a little bit more forgiving in that regard in terms of that playstyle. Even Karis was winning in the mid lane, which is never a good sign for the team that's going into WE because he is the weak link of this roster. You know, Xiao which we will talk about on the other side, was miserable for LGD, and he has been throughout basically the entirety of the spring split. So, you know, Karis coming in and being the better mid laner is not shocking, but seeing him do it on things like Akali and Aurora is really not a great sign for LGD. Even Cube, I thought, was really great here. The Aatrox in particular in Game 3. You know, Aatrox looked really good in the play-in stage. I'm not sure that that's something that's always going to translate into the playoffs, but certainly something that's at the very least worth noting is that Aatrox actually was a pretty strong champion, and Cube did well into Sasa in this series. And overall, WE was better across the board. Even though they dropped game number 2, I think you can look at game 2 and just say, well, you know, Pantheon ended up getting fed, Zeri got a lot of gold, Yorick was in a side lane. Like, it's difficult to play that game from behind. Everything else was really controlled by WE, and they were the better team in this series by a considerable margin. So credit to them, and credit to a team that I thought was going to be a disaster actually making playoffs here in the spring split. And then for LGD, again, we already talked about it, but it's just a bit unfortunate for whatever reason that Nio was not able to play in this series because of just how good he's been for LGD. That being said, Climber was probably the best player on their team. It might not show up quite as much in the KDA because players like Xiaoya actually had like good KDAs throughout a lot of this series, but I think Climber was the one creating a lot of action. The Pantheon in particular in game number 2, the one game they ended up winning, was tremendously good. It's just everybody else on the team that ended up really letting them down. I think specifically Xiao Qinghua in the mid lane and then YCX in the support position were both quite bad in this series. I'm giving Dead of the Series to Xiao Qinghua in the mid lane because I think he was worse. I think in terms of the 3 games that they lost, he was awful on Azir, he was awful on Victor, and he was awful on Yone. Like, he just was not functional in any of the games that they ended up losing. He was down in CS, he was down in gold, and he certainly was down in pressure throughout the entire series, and that's going into the weak link, as I've said, of WE. It's just really not acceptable for him to play the way that he has over the past couple of months. I think he is the worst player on LGD. I think he's proven at this point he probably doesn't have the mechanics to be able to function at the LPL level. If that's going to be the case, I would recommend they move in a different direction as quickly as possible. LGD is a team that is very close to actually being able to compete for like top 8 or top 9. I think if they had a better mid laner, this series all of a sudden becomes a lot more interesting. I really do think that's the margin that they're on. YCX also did underperform. He's been better as of late. I think he was fine in Group Nirvana in terms of how he played. Him and Xiaoya were actually decently solid as a bot lane duo in Group Nirvana, but, you know, YCX kind of getting exposed by a team that actually knows what to do against a support that might be a little behind in tempo, something that might not have been taken advantage of much in their regular season. Already talked about it a bit, but Sasa was not necessarily great on the top side of the map. Typically speaking, we talk about him as more of a feast or famine type of top laner. When he wins hard. When he loses incredibly hard. He was more irrelevant in this series than that, where it just didn't really ever come up. He was actually pretty bad in game 3 on the Udyr. That's really the one game you can point at and be like, not so good from him. Cube ended up getting a pretty gigantic advantage on the Aatrox, and it kind of took Sasa out of the game. But overall for LGD, I think their lack of just raw mechanical talent ended up coming into play here. These two teams are in decently similar positions where neither of them are particularly experienced in best of 5s, but it is clear that WE is just a more talented team with a better direction, and LGD ended up paying the price for that. But WE gets to move on to the playoffs now against something that I thought was impossible heading into the year. This team has superseded any sort of expectations you could have possibly had for them at the beginning of 2025 and turned themselves into a legit, interesting, and fun team to watch. But that's going to bring us to our final play-in series here, and probably the one that was the most dominant of them all. It was Weibo Gaming taking on Thunder Talk Gaming, the 7 versus 10, and Weibo blows them out of the water. This is not even remotely competitive in terms of how these games end up going down. Weibo decimates Thunder Talk, and honestly, we saw this coming. This was the one I think I projected to be a 3-0 in the first place, and you know what? Weibo definitely lived up to that expectation. First and foremost, Erha is back in the support position. That means Hong is back out. You guys know my thoughts on this situation if you followed the channel. It might not be the most popular of takes. I think Erha somehow maybe offers a little bit of a higher floor, but I think Hong's upside is still way better. I think his best moments have always been better in terms of what he has been as a support, and I think Weibo generally breaks every player that comes through that role in terms of how this organization has played over the past couple of years, and so I'm not necessarily putting Hong's inconsistencies on him as the player, more so on the team dynamic. I think he will be just fine, but if Erha is a player they feel more comfortable playing, that's fine. I know they've gone through some coaching changes over the past couple of weeks. You know, whatever they want to go with, whatever they feel is the best version of their lineup, that's what they should play. And if Erha is that, then who am I to sit here and judge? Erha has probably been more productive than Hong, specifically this split, and so if you completely ignore Hong's career, then I think it's totally fine. But, you know, for Thunder Talk on the other side, this team is just not good. I think there's a real shot this is like a bottom 4 or 5 team in the LPL, that they're probably not like a group ascend worthy team, especially now that Beishuan is gone, now that he's gone to BLG. I think the solo laners are tremendously awful and they got mega exposed in this series. Jungle was certainly not a strength, even if it wasn't the biggest weakness in the entire world. Thunder Talk is just not particularly good, and that very much got exposed in this series, in my opinion. So we might spend a little bit less time talking about this because there really isn't a ton to analyze or talk about. You know, Weibo's just better in basically every aspect. So let's go ahead and get into it. Tien is going to get my player of the series. This was not going to go to anybody else. I guess theoretically you could give this to Xiaohu in the mid lane, who also was incredibly good, and Satab was awful in this series, but Tien was really the player that was pushing this team forward the most, specifically on the Wukong in game number 2, where he decimated that game. I mean, truly blew it wide open. And then, of course, also on the Poppy in game number 3, where his setups were immaculate to be able to make Xiaohu's job easier, Light's job easier, just everything kind of falling into place once Tien was playing as well as he was. This is a guy who's been pretty inconsistent throughout 2025. I was expecting a ton more. We talked about the big 3 in the jungle coming into the year of Tarzan, Kanavi, and Tien. Like, they were the 3 junglers that everybody was putting a whole tier above everybody else, even players like Shun and Wei that I think were kind of considered near that. At least in my opinion, they were a tier above everybody, and Tien's just not lived up to that. Kanavi's been great. I think obviously Tarzan's been great. You can kind of give both of them their flowers, but Tien has kind of lagged behind. It's nice to see him step up when it really matters as a carry, specifically in game number 2 on the Wukong, and be kind of the main option in terms of setup for this team, especially when their support position is in such flux right now. If you need a teamfight playmaker, Tien can step up and be that. He's been that in the past for basically every team he's been on. But Xiaohu, you know, really kind of getting into form here. I'm going to continue what I said in my All-Pro voting, where, you know, I put Xiaohu second team All-Pro. I think people forget just how good this guy was at the beginning of the split, and I understand his playstyle does not indicate that he is like a super talented dominant player, because the things he's really good at are not very flashy. He's really not that great of a laner. He's not that great of a 1v1 player. He's never been a great 1v1 player. Even going back to when he was winning MSIs on RNG, he's really not been this guy that's generating gigantic gold leads or XP leads for himself in the mid lane. But what he is one of the most consistent team fighters in the entire region, and he continues to really push that forward. When you are giving him leads in the early game like he was able to get in this series, then it's just kind of over, because he's really good at being able to push his advantages if he is able to get it. Still, to this day, he was incredibly productive at the beginning of the split. Weibo goes on this gigantic cold streak and he's not good at all in that run, and it makes people forget just where he was. But in a league where mid lane has been super inconsistent outside of Knight for Billy, would I like to have Xiaohu, like, as one of the first 5 mid laners I'm picking right now? Maybe. Like, certainly I would consider it, and I think that a lot of people are just not on that train. I understand that mechanically speaking, there are some things to be desired in terms of how Xiaohu plays, but I'm going to continue to defend him. I think a lot of the negatives that you're giving him are without context surrounding the rest of his game, and I think with context, he's been an asset and a real value to Weibo Gaming over the course of this split, and especially if Tien is going to step up. If that middle of the map is just going to dominate, that makes things more difficult for Weibo Gaming. Breathe was really solid in the series. Hoya was a nightmare, especially in game 2 on that Renekton, and Breathe very much punished that. Light and Erha looked solid. They looked confident. Erha had a couple of nice setups throughout this series. Light was mostly, you know, in the background. He wasn't really a main player, and honestly, I've been pretty disappointed by Light over the course of 2025, at least in comparison to what he's been in previous years, but it certainly was enough to get by a Thunder Talk team that just feels like they are floundering at the current moment, and this was expected. Like, I was not high on this team at all, even after their win at the end of the final regular season series. It just was like, okay, well, what do Hoya and Satab do in a best of 5 when, you know, a lot of their champions start to get taken off the menu? Satab even got a lot of the champions that we associate with him. It's a lot of these assassins that want to move around in skirmish in the mid game. Ahri, Sylas, Akali, a lot of these champions that he's supposed to be, like, really proficient at diving onto the backline. He was just getting abused on these picks. He is the easy choice for dead of the series. I say easy choice. Hoya was also miserably bad on the top side, contributed to basically nothing throughout this series, but Satab was just so freaking miserable in terms of how he played these games, and him being completely taken out of things was a nightmare. I think arguably, you know, game 3 is one of the worst Akali games I've ever watched. Like, he just did nothing. Some setups in that game were actually pretty solid. I think even more so, the setups in game 1 were really solid. Ahri wasn't even all that behind in terms of the gold that she was at, but You had Pantheon and Alistair basically lining up things for free for the Ahri to take over, and then he was missing like point-blank charms. It's not acceptable. He played okay on the Sylas in game 2, but that was the one game where there wasn't actually any sort of setup for him to do anything, and he still was going in and dying in basically every single fight. This was just a miserable series for Satab on the champions that we wanted to see out of him in this best of 5, and adding on top of that, I'm certainly not going to try to make this statement concrete because he's gotten such limited opportunities at this level, and then obviously this is a player who already is expected to be a bit overmatched in the playoffs, but this guy has played 3 best of 5s this year, or 3 like actual playoff series best of 5s for Thunder Talk, and has gotten slaughtered in all 3. He got slaughtered in the winter split in both of the series they played in the playoffs. He was easily the worst player on the Rift there, and it once again happened here. I'm not going to sit here and say that Satab is some sort of playoff underperformer, because that would indicate that we were expecting him to do better than this, and I don't know if that's the case, but definitely worth noting that every single playoff game this guy has ever played, he has been an absolute nightmare in. Like, he has been a disaster for his team. So certainly something to keep in mind moving forward if this team's form or if his form ever does get any more consistent. Hoya was also awful. Again, I'm not really expecting anything out of him. He's just not a particularly talented player when he goes into a top laner that's actually trying. It's really difficult to imagine a world where he ends up actually winning, and that's what happened here. Xiao Huangren had a couple of nice setups overall, but like generally was super out-tempoed in the series. Tien was super fast with his clear, and Xiao Huangren playing carries just was never, able to get any sort of advantages, which is not good. 1xN was fine. Feather was generally fine, even if he was dying in instances he probably didn't need to. I'm not really blaming the bot lane here. This was once again a solo lane gap, and that has kind of been the case for Thunder Talk throughout this entire split, and that's something they're going to have to work on going into summer. I really don't know if you're going to be able to make roster changes in a way that is like super meaningful for this team, but if you're capable of doing so, I don't think they're that far off from being a top 8 or 9 team. I just think that, especially with these solo laners, you're probably never going to get there, even if the bot lane does start to step up. And for Weibo, this was expected. It's about time they start getting into form. They can win on any given day. They've just not been able to find their own form and their own confidence. If this is the change, if getting rid of their head coach, their head coach that's only a name because he's not been on stage, if getting rid of him and putting Hong back down onto the bench and bringing Erha back up, if that's what they need in order to feel confident and comfortable again to allow the middle of the map to open up a bit more, then I'm all for it. I just need this team to start playing up to their own skill level, because so far at the end of this split, it's just been nothing but frustration. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LPL plans overview and analysis video, and it is finally time for the playoffs. We know our 8 teams that have officially qualified for the playoffs, the 4 that, were top of their group ascent, and the 4 that won their series in the play-ins, so we know our matchups. If you see a couple of weird seeding, decisions like 2 versus 6 or 3 versus 7, that's because the format here was that the number 1 team got to choose their opponent first, the number 2 team got to choose their opponent second, number 3 third, and number 4 fourth of the play-in teams. And so it ended up working out like this. Top Esports ended up choosing FunPlus Phoenix, makes a lot of sense. Anyone's Legend then, instead of choosing Weibo Gaming, chose Team WE. I also think this makes a ton of sense. WE is probably an easier opponent to beat for AL than Weibo Gaming is certainly a more predictable one. That means JDG had to choose between Weibo and Invictus. They chose Weibo because of the form they've been in. Totally agree with that. And that means Billy, and Invictus are facing off in round 1. So that's why we ended up in a little bit of a different circumstance in terms of how these teams ended up breaking down. But we are quickly going to preview this round number 1, I guess, slate of games, because that's going to be our next video, is all 4 of these series. First, Top Esports versus FunPlus Phoenix. This should be a pretty easy one to predict. FPX is super good at taking advantage of mistakes, and it's not like Top Esports doesn't make those. Kanavi certainly is going to step up a little bit too far. Cream is not always the most, consistent player in the world. It's not like Jackie Love and Crisp are known for their consistency either, and so you can kind of expect Top Esports to make some mistakes. I think that gets FPX 1 game in this series, and my prediction is going to be Top Esports 3-1. When it comes to this, the most interesting series is the one that comes next, which is Billy Gaming taking on Invictus Gaming, 2 of the best teams in the entire league, certainly 2 of the hottest teams in the entire league. I think this series is really going to tell us a lot about where these teams stand, because Invictus, if they're able to pick up this gigantic win, all of a sudden that makes things a lot more interesting for the playoffs moving forward. But at least for now, I'm going to live on the edge, and I'm going to pick Billy Gaming. I'm going to pick 3-2. I do believe this is going to be a back and forth series, but I think BLG will be able to overcome them. And honestly, right now, no spoilers for the rest of my bracket predictions. I'm not doing like a full bracket, breakdown or anything. I think BLG is going to win the LPL. I know that's not necessarily the most popular take. I think they win the LPL. We'll see how that ends up aging. Then you've got Anyone's Legend taking on WE. This to me is easy. I think it's AL 3-0. I think they end up sweeping WE out. I don't really see an avenue for WE to be able to win this series. What are their strengths? Well, Monkey has been pretty good in the jungle. Tarzan is simply just better. Okay, well, Tyun and Vampire have been getting better over the course of the past couple of weeks. Well, Hope and KL are maybe the most consistent bot lane in the entire league. I just don't really see a lot of avenues for WE specifically in this matchup, and so I think AL will win it 3-0. And then finally, JD Gaming versus Weibo Gaming. I think this is going to be closer than people expect it to be. I think Weibo is going to step up as they do in the playoffs. I think JDG will still be able to overcome it, but I'm a little bit worried about the inconsistency of this team. If Breathe can be better than Alla on the top side, things become a lot more interesting for Weibo Gaming. So I'm actually predicting JDG, but 3-2, which I don't think is going to be the most popular prediction in the world. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with in terms of those predictions down in the comment section below. Always curious to know whether you guys agree or disagree with my takes as we get further along into the playoffs, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be covering the rest of the LPL playoffs as we always do on the channel, but we're covering all of the playoffs happening everywhere around the world. That's LTA North, LEC, and LCK. Of course, NACL as well, Tier 2 over in North America. So if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, especially as we build to MSI, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all